Book 3, The Harvest of the Food. Chapter the First, The Altered World. 1. Change played in its new fashion with the world for 20 years. To most men, the new things came little by little and day by day, remarkably enough, but not so abruptly as to overwhelm. But to one man, at least, the full accumulation of those 2 decades of the food's work was to be revealed suddenly and amazingly in one day. For our purpose, it is convenient to take him for that one day and to tell something of the things he saw. This man was a convict, a prisoner for life (his crime is no concern of ours), whom the law saw fit to pardon after 20 years. One summer morning this poor wretch, who had left the world a young man of 23, found himself thrust out again from the grey simplicity of toil and discipline that had become his life, into a dazzling freedom. They had put unaccustomed clothes upon him. His hair had been growing for some weeks, and he had parted it now for some days, and there he stood, in a sort of shabby and clumsy newness of body and mind, blinking with his eyes, and blinking indeed with his soul, outside again, trying to realize one incredible thing, that, after all, he was again for a little while in the world of life, and for all other incredible things, totally unprepared. He was so fortunate as to have a brother who cared enough for their distant common memories to come and meet him and clasp his hand, a brother he had left a little lad, and who was now a bearded, prosperous man, whose very eyes were unfamiliar. And together he and this stranger from his kindred came down into the town of Dover, saying little to one another, and feeling many things. They sat for a space in a public-house, the one answering the questions of the other about this person and that, reviving queer old points of view, brushing aside endless new aspects and new perspectives, and then it was time to go to the station and take the London train. Their names and the personal things they had to talk of do not matter to our story, but only the changes and all the strangeness that this poor returning soul found in the once familiar world. In Dover itself, he remarked little except the goodness of beer from pewter. Never before had there been such a draught of beer, and it brought tears of gratitude to his eyes. "Beer's as good as ever," said he, believing it infinitely better. It was only as the train rattled them past Folkestone that he could look out beyond his more immediate emotions to see what had happened to the world. He peered out of the window. "It's sunny," he said for the 12th time. "I couldn't have had better weather." And then for the first time it dawned upon him that there were novel disproportions in the world. "Lord sakes!" he cried, sitting up and looking animated for the first time. "But them's mortal great thistles growing out there on the bank by that broom. If so they be thistles? Or have I been forgetting?" But they were thistles, and what he took for tall bushes of broom was the new grass. And amidst these things, a company of British soldiers, red-coated as ever, was skirmishing in accordance with the directions of the drill book that had been partially revised after the Boer War. Then whack into a tunnel, and then into Sandling Junction, which was now embedded and dark. Its lamps were all alight, in a great thicket of rhododendron that had crept out of some adjacent gardens and grown enormously up the valley. There was a train of trucks on the Sandgate siding, piled high with rhododendron logs, and here it was the returning citizen heard first of Boom Food. As they sped out into a country again that seemed absolutely unchanged, the 2 brothers were hard at their explanations. The one was full of eager, dull questions. The other had never thought, had never troubled to see the thing as a single fact, and he was elusive and difficult to follow. "It's this here Boom Food stuff," he said, touching his bottom rock of knowledge. "Don't you know? Haven't they told you, any of 'em? Boom Food! You know, Boom Food! What all the election's about. Scientific sort of stuff. Hasn't no one ever told you?" He thought prison had made his brother a fearful duffer not to know that. They made wide shots at each other by way of question and answer. Between these scraps of talk were intervals of window-gazing. At first the man's interest in things was vague and general. His imagination had been busy with what old so-and-so would say, how so-and-so would look, how he would say to all and sundry certain things that would present his putting away in a mitigated light. This boom food came in at first as it were a thing in an odd paragraph of the newspapers, then as a source of intellectual difficulty with his brother. But it came to him presently that boom food was persistently coming in upon any topic he began. In those days, the world was a patchwork of transition, so that this great new fact came to him in a series of shocks of contrast. The process of change had not been uniform. It had spread from one center of distribution here and another center there. The country was in patches, great areas where the food was still to come, and areas where it was already in the soil and in the air, sporadic and contagious. It was a bold new motif, creeping in among ancient and venerable airs. The contrast was very vivid indeed along the line from Dover to London at that time. For a space they traversed just such a countryside as he had known since his childhood. The small oblongs of field, hedge-lined, of a size for pygmy horses to plough. The little roads 3 cart-widths wide, the elms and oaks and poplars dotting these fields about, little thickets of willow beside the streams, ricks of hay no higher than a giant's knees, dolls' cottages with diamond panes, brick fields, and straggling village streets, the larger houses of the petty great, flower-grown railway banks, garden-set stations, and all the little things of the vanished 19th century still holding out against immensity. Here and there would be a patch of wind-sown, wind-tattered giant thistle, defying the axe. Here and there a 10-foot puffball, or the ashen stems of some burnt-out patch of monster grass. But that was all there was to hint at the coming of the food. For a couple of score of miles there was nothing else to foreshadow in any way the strange bigness of the wheat and of the weeds that were hidden from him not a dozen miles from his route, just over the hills in the Cheesing Eyebright Valley. And then, presently, the traces of the food would begin. The first striking thing was the great new viaduct at Tonbridge, where the swamp of the choked Medway, due to a giant variety of chara, began in those days. Then again the little country. And then, as the petty multitudinous immensity of London spread out under its haze, the traces of man's fight to keep out greatness became abundant and incessant. In that southeastern region of London at that time, and all about where Chaucer and his children lived, the food had become mysteriously insurgent at 100 points. The little life went on amidst daily portents that only the deliberation of their increase, the slow parallel growth of usage to their presence, had robbed of their warning. But this returning citizen peered out to see for the first time the facts of the food, strange and predominant, scarred and blackened areas, big unsightly defenses and preparations, barracks and arsenals that this subtle, persistent influence had forced into the life of men. Here on an ampler scale, the experience of the first experimental farm had been repeated time and again. It had been in the inferior and accidental things of life, underfoot and in waste places, irregularly and irrelevantly, that the coming of a new force and new issues had first declared itself. There were great evil-smelling yards and enclosures where some invincible jungle of weed furnished fuel for gigantic machinery. Little cockneys came to stare at its clangorous oiliness and tip the men a sixpence. There were roads and tracks for big motors and vehicles, roads made of the interwoven fibers of hypertrophied hemp. There were towers containing steam sirens that could yell at once and warn the world against any new insurgence of vermin, or, what was queerer, venerable church towers conspicuously fitted with a mechanical scream. There were little red-painted refuge huts and garrison shelters, each with its 300-yard rifle range, where the riflemen practiced daily with soft-nosed ammunition at targets in the shape of monstrous rats. 6 times since the day of the Skinners there had been outbreaks of giant rats, each time from the southwest London sewers, and now they were as much an accepted fact there as tigers in the Delta by Calcutta. The man's brother had bought a paper in a heedless sort of way at Sandling, and at last this chanced to catch the eye of the released man. He opened the unfamiliar sheets. They seemed to him to be smaller, more numerous, and different in type from the papers of the times before, and he found himself confronted with innumerable pictures about things so strange as to be uninteresting, and with tall columns of printed matter whose headings, for the most part, were as unmeaning as though they had been written in a foreign tongue. Great speech by Mr. Catterham. The boom food laws. Who's this here Catterham? He asked, in an attempt to make conversation. He's all right, said his brother. Ah, sort of politician, eh? Going to turn out the government. Jolly well time he did. He reflected. I suppose all the lot I used to know. Chamberlain, Rosebery, all that lot. What? His brother had grasped his wrist and pointed out the window. That's the Cossers. The eyes of the released prisoner followed the finger's direction and saw... My God! He cried, for the first time really overcome with amazement. The paper dropped into final forgottenness between his feet. Through the trees he could see very distinctly, standing in an easy attitude, the legs wide apart, and the hand grasping a ball as if about to throw it, a gigantic human figure a good 40 feet high. The figure glittered in the sunlight, clad in a suit of woven white metal, and belted with a broad belt of steel. For a moment it focused all attention, and then the eye was wrested to another more distant giant who stood prepared to catch, and it became apparent that the whole area of that great bay in the hills just north of Sevenoaks had been scarred to gigantic ends. A hugely banked entrenchment overhung the chalk pit, in which stood the house, a monstrous squat Egyptian shape that Cosser had built for his sons when the giant nursery had served its turn, and behind was a great dark shed that might have covered a cathedral, in which a spluttering incandescence came and went, and from out of which came a titanic hammering to beat upon the ear. Then the attention leapt back to the giant, as the great ball of iron-bound timber soared up out of his hand. The two men stood up and stared. The ball seemed as big as a cask. Caught! Cried the man from prison, as a tree blotted out the thrower. The train looked on these things only for the fraction of a minute, and then passed behind trees into the Chislehurst tunnel. My God! Said the man from prison again, as the darkness closed about them. Why, that chap was as high as a house. That's them young Cossers, said his brother, jerking his head elusively. What all this trouble's about. They emerged again to discover more siren-surmounted towers, more red huts, and then the clustering villas of the outer suburbs. The art of bill-sticking had lost nothing in the interval, and from countless tall hoardings, from house-ends, from palings, and 100 such points of vantage, came the polychromatic appeals of the great boom-food election. Catterham, boom-food, and Jack the Giant Killer, again and again and again, and monstrous caricatures and distortions, 100 varieties of misrepresentations of those great and shining figures they had passed so nearly only a few minutes before. 2. It had been the purpose of the younger brother to do a very magnificent thing, to celebrate this return to life by a dinner at some restaurant of indisputable quality, a dinner that should be followed by all that glittering succession of impressions the music halls of those days were so capable of giving. It was a worthy plan to wipe off the more superficial stains of the prison house by this display of free indulgence, but so far as the second item went, the plan was changed. The dinner stood, but there was a desire already more powerful than the appetite for shows, already more efficient in turning the man's mind away from his grim prepossession with his past than any theater could be, and that was an enormous curiosity and perplexity about this boom-food and these boom-children, this new portentous giantry that seemed to dominate the world. I haven't the hang of 'em, he said. They disturb me. His brother had that fineness of mind that can even set aside a contemplated hospitality. It's your evening, dear old boy, he said. We'll try to get into the mass meeting at the People's Palace. And at last the man from prison had the luck to find himself wedged into a packed multitude and staring from afar at a little brightly lit platform under an organ and a gallery. The organist had been playing something that had set boots tramping as the people swarmed in, but that was over now. Hardly had the man from prison settled into place and done his quarrel with an importunate stranger who elbowed, before Catterham came. He walked out of a shadow towards the middle of the platform, the most insignificant little pygmy away there in the distance, a little black figure with a pink dab for a face. In profile one saw his quite distinctive aquiline nose, a little figure that trailed after it most inexplicably. A cheer. A cheer it was that began away there, and grew and spread. A little spluttering of voices about the platform at first, that suddenly leapt up into a flame of sound and swept athwart the whole mass of humanity within the building and without. How they cheered! Hooray! Hooray! No one in all those myriads cheered like the man from prison. The tears poured down his face, and he only stopped cheering at last because the thing had choked him. You must have been in prison as long as he before you can understand, or even begin to understand, what it means to a man to let his lungs go in a crowd. But for all that, he did not even pretend to himself that he knew what all this emotion was about. Hooray! Oh, God! Hooray! And then a sort of silence. Catterham had subsided to a conspicuous patience, and subordinate and inaudible persons were saying and doing formal and insignificant things. It was like hearing voices through the noise of leaves in spring. Wah, 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 wah. What did it matter? People in the audience talked to one another. Wah, 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 wah. The thing went on. Would that gray-headed duffer never have done? Interrupting? Of course they were interrupting. Wah, 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 wah. But shall we hear Catterham any better? Meanwhile, at any rate, there was Catterham to stare at, and one could stand and study the distant prospect of the great man's features. He was easy to draw, was this man, and already the world had him to study at leisure on lamp chimneys and children's plates, on anti-boom food medals and anti-boom food flags, on the selvages of Catterham silks and cottons, and in the linings of good old English Catterham hats. He pervades all the caricature of that time. One sees him as a sailor standing to an old-fashioned gun, a port-fire labeled New Boom Food Laws in his hand, while in the sea wallows that huge, ugly, threatening monster, Boom Food. Or he is cap-a-pie in armor, St. George's cross on shield and helm, and a cowardly Titanic Caliban sitting amidst desecrations at the mouth of a horrid cave declines his gauntlet of the new boom food regulations. Or he comes flying down as Perseus and rescues a chained and beautiful Andromeda, labeled distinctly about her belt as Civilization, from a wallowing waste of sea monster bearing upon its various necks and claws irreligion, trampling egotism, mechanism, monstrosity, and the like. But it was as Jack the Giant Killer that the popular imagination considered Catterham most correctly cast, and it was in the vein of a Jack the Giant Killer poster that the man from prison enlarged that distant miniature. The wah 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 came abruptly to an end. He's done. He's sitting down. Yes. No. Yes, it's Catterham! 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 And then came the cheers. It takes a multitude to make such a stillness as followed that disorder of cheering. A man alone in a wilderness, it's stillness of a sort, no doubt. But he hears himself breathe, he hears himself move, he hears all sorts of things. Here the voice of Catterham was the one single thing heard, a thing very bright and clear, like a little light burning in a black velvet recess. Here, indeed, one heard him as though he spoke at one's elbow. It was stupendously effective to the man from prison, that gesticulating little figure in a halo of light, in a halo of rich and swaying sounds. Behind it, partially effaced as it were, sat its supporters on the platform, and in the foreground was a wide perspective of innumerable backs and profiles, a vast multitudinous attention. That little figure seemed to have absorbed the substance from them all. Catterham spoke of our ancient institutions. "Ear, ear!" roared the crowd. "Ear, ear!" said the man from prison. He spoke of our ancient spirit of order and justice. "Ear, ear, ear!" roared the crowd. "Ear, ear!" cried the man from prison, deeply moved. He spoke of the wisdom of our forefathers, of the slow growth of venerable institutions, of moral and social traditions that fitted our English national characteristics as the skin fits the hand. "Ear, ear!" groaned the man from prison. with tears of excitement on his cheeks. And now all these things were to go into the melting pot. Yes, into the melting pot. Because 3 men in London 20 years ago had seen fit to mix something indescribable in a bottle, all the order and sanctity of things. Cries of, "No! No!" Well, if it was not to be so, they must exert themselves. They must say good-bye to hesitation. Here there came a gust of cheering. They must say good-bye to hesitation and half-measures. "We have heard, gentlemen," cried Catterham, "of nettles that become giant nettles. At first they are no more than other nettles, little plants that a firm hand may grasp and wrench away. But if you leave them, they grow with such a power of poisonous expansion that at last you must needs have axe and rope, you must needs have danger to life and limb, you must needs have toil and distress. Men may be killed in their felling, men may be killed in their felling." There came a stir and interruption, and then the man from prison heard Catterham's voice once again, ringing clear and strong. "Learn about Boomfood from Boomfood itself, and—" He paused. "Grasp your nettle before it is too late." He stopped and stood wiping his lips. "A crystal!" cried someone. "A crystal!" And then came that same strange swift growth to thunderous tumult, until the whole world seemed cheering. The man from prison came out of the hall at last, marvelously stirred, and with that in his face that marks those who have seen a vision. He knew, everyone knew. His ideas were no longer vague. He had come back to a world in crisis, to the immediate decision of a stupendous issue. He must play his part in the great conflict like a man, like a free, responsible man. The antagonism presented itself as a picture. On the one hand, those easy, gigantic, mail-clad figures of the morning. One saw them now in a different light. On the other, this little black-clad, gesticulating creature under the limelight, that pygmy thing with its ordered flow of melodious persuasion, its little marvelously penetrating voice, John Catterham, Jack the Giant Killer. They must all unite to grasp the nettle before it was too late. Book 3, Chapter 1, Parts 3 through 5 of The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth by H.G. Wells. The tallest and strongest and most regarded of all the children of the food were the 3 sons of Chaucer. The mile or so of land near Sevenoaks in which their boyhood passed became so trenched, so dug out and twisted about, so covered with sheds and huge working models and all the play of their developing powers, it was like no other place on earth. And long since it had become too little for the things they sought to do. The eldest son was a mighty schemer of wheeled engines. He had made himself a sort of giant bicycle that no road in the world had room for, no bridge could bear. There it stood, a great thing of wheels and engines, capable of 250 miles an hour, useless, save that now and then he would mount it and fling himself backwards and forwards across that cumbered workyard. He had meant to go around the little world with it. He had made it with that intention, while he was still no more than a dreaming boy. Now its spokes were rusted deep red like wounds, wherever the enamel had been chipped away. "You must make a road for it first, sonny," Chaucer had said, "before you can do that." So one morning about dawn, the young giant and his brothers had set to work to make a road about the world. They seemed to have had an inkling of opposition impending, and they had worked with remarkable vigor. The world had discovered them soon enough, driving that road as straight as a flight of a bullet towards the English Channel, already some miles of it leveled and made and stamped hard. They had been stopped before midday by a vast crowd of excited people, owners of land, land agents, local authorities, lawyers, policemen, soldiers even. "We're making a road," the biggest boy had explained. "Make a road by all means," said the leading lawyer on the ground, "but please respect the rights of other people. You have already infringed the private rights of 27 private proprietors, let alone the special privileges and property of an urban district board, 9 parish councils, a county council, 2 gasworks, and a railway company. Goodness, said the elder boy Cosser. You will have to stop it. But don't you want a nice straight road in the place of all these rotten, ruddy little lanes? I won't say it wouldn't be advantageous, but it isn't to be done, said the eldest Cosser boy, picking up his tools. Not in this way, said the lawyer, certainly. How is it to be done? The leading lawyer's answer had been complicated and vague. Cosser had come down to see the mischief his children had done, and reproved them severely, and laughed enormously, and seems to be extremely happy over the affair. You boys must wait a bit, he shouted up to them, before you can do things like that. The lawyer told us we must begin by preparing a scheme, and getting special powers, and all sorts of rot. Said it would take us years. We'll have a scheme before long, little boy, cried Cosser, hands to his mouth as he shouted. Never fear. For a bit you'd better play about and make models of the things you want to do. They did as he told them, like obedient sons. But for all that, the Cosser lads brooded a little. It's all very well, said the second to the first, but I don't always want to just play about and plan. I want to do something real, you know. We didn't come into this world so strong as we are just to play about in this messy little bit of ground, you know, and take little walks and keep out of the towns. For by that time they were forbidden all boroughs and urban districts. Doing nothing's just wicked. Can't we find out something the little people want done and do it for them, just for the fun of doing it? Lots of them haven't houses fit to live in, said the second boy. Let's go and build 'em a house close up to London that will hold heaps and heaps of them and be ever so comfortable and nice, and let's make 'em a nice little road to where they all go and do business, a nice straight little road, and make it all as nice as nice. We'll make it all so clean and pretty that they won't any of them be able to live grubby and beastly like most of them do now. Water enough for them to wash with we'll have. You know they're so dirty now that 9 out of 10 of their houses haven't even baths in them, the filthy little skunks. You know, the ones that have baths spit insults at the ones that haven't, instead of helping them to get them, and call them the great unwashed, you know. We'll alter all that, and we'll make electricity light, and cook and clean up for them and all. Fancy, they make their women who are going to be mothers, crawl about and scrub floors. We could make it all beautifully. We could bank up a valley in that range of hills over there, and make a nice reservoir, and we could make a big place here to generate our electricity, and have it all simply lovely. Couldn't we, brother? And then perhaps they'd let us do some other things. Yes, said the elder brother, we could do it very nice for them. Then let's, said the second brother. I don't mind, said the elder brother, and looked about for a handy tool. And that led to another dreadful bother. Agitated multitudes were at them in no time, telling them for 1,000 reasons to stop, telling them to stop for no reason at all, babbling confused and varied multitudes. The place they were building was too high. It couldn't possibly be safe. It was ugly. It interfered with the letting of proper-sized houses in the neighborhood. It ruined the tone of the neighborhood. It was unneighborly. It was contrary to the local building regulations. It infringed the right of the local authority to muddle about with a minute, expensive electric supply of its own. It interfered with the concerns of the local water company. Local government board clerks roused themselves to judicial obstruction. The little lawyer turned up again to represent about a dozen threatened interests. Local landowners appeared in opposition. People with mysterious claims claimed to be bought off at exorbitant rates. The trade unions of all the building trades lifted up collective voices, and a ring of dealers in all sorts of building material became a bar. Extraordinary associations of people with prophetic visions of aesthetic horrors rallied to protect the scenery of the place where they would build the great house, of the valley where they would bank up the water. These last people were absolutely the worst asses of the lot, the Cosser boys considered. That beautiful house of the Cosser boys was just like a walking stick thrust into a wasp's nest in no time. I never did, said the elder boy. We can't go on, said the second brother. Rotten little beasts they are, said the third of the brothers. "We can't do anything." "Even when it's for their own comfort. Such a nice place we'd have made for them, too." "They seem to spend their silly little lives getting in each other's way," said the eldest boy. "Rights and laws and regulations and rascalities is like a game of spellikins. Well, anyhow, they'll have to live in their grubby, dirty, silly little houses for a bit longer. It's very evident we can't go on with this." And the Cossor children left that great house unfinished, a mere hole of foundations and the beginning of a wall, and sulked back to their big enclosure. After a time, the hole was filled with water, and with stagnation, and weeds, and vermin, and the food, either dropped there by the sons of Cossor, or blowing thither as dust, set growth going in its usual fashion. Water voles came out over the country and did infinite havoc, and one day a farmer caught his pigs drinking there, and instantly, and with great presence of mind, for he knew of the great hog of Oakham, slew them all. And from that deep pool it was the mosquitoes came, quite terrible mosquitoes, whose only virtue was that the sons of Cossor, after being bitten for a little, could stand the thing no longer, but chose a moonlight night when law and order were abed, and drained the water clean away into the river by brook. But they left the big weeds and the big water voles and all sorts of big undesirable things still living and breeding on the site they had chosen, the site on which the fair great house of the little people might have towered to heaven. 4. That had been in the boyhood of the sons, but now they were nearly men. And the chains had been tightening upon them and tightening with every year of growth. Each year they grew, and the food spread, and great things multiplied. Each year the stress and tension rose. The food had been at first for the great mass of mankind a distant marvel, and now it was coming home to every threshold, and threatening, pressing against, and distorting the whole order of life. It blocked this, it overturned that, it changed natural products, and by changing natural products it stopped employments and threw men out of work by the 100,000. It swept over boundaries and turned the world of trade into a world of cataclysms. No wonder mankind hated it. And since it is easier to hate animate than inanimate things, animals more than plants, and one's fellow men more completely than any animals, the fear and trouble engendered by giant nettles and 6-foot grass blades, awful insects and tiger-like vermin, grew all into one great power of detestation that aimed itself with a simple directness at that scattered band of great human beings, the children of the food. That hatred had become the central force in political affairs. The old party lines had been traversed and effaced altogether under the insistence of these newer issues, and the conflict lay now with the party of the temporizers, who were for putting little political men to control and regulate the food, and the party of reaction for whom Caterham spoke, speaking always with a more sinister ambiguity, crystallizing his intention first in one threatening phrase and then another, now that men must prune the bramble growths, now that they must find a cure for elephantiasis, and at last, upon the eve of the election, that they must grasp the nettle. One day the 3 sons of Cossor, who were now no longer boys but men, sat among the masses of their futile work and talked together, after their fashion, of all these things. They had been working all day at one of a series of great and complicated trenches their father had bid them make, and now it was sunset, and they sat in the little garden space before the great house, and looked at the world and rested, until the little servants within should say their food was ready. You must figure these mighty forms, 40 feet high the least of them was, reclining on a patch of turf that would have seemed a stubble of reeds to a common man. One sat up and chipped earth from his huge boots with an iron girder he grasped in his hand. The second rested on his elbow. The third whittled a pine tree into shape and made a smell of resin in the air. They were clothed not in cloth, but in undergarments of woven rope and outer clothes of felted aluminum wire. They were shod with timber and iron, and the links and buttons and belts of their clothing were all of plated steel. The great single-storied house they lived in, Egyptian in its massiveness, half built of monstrous blocks of chalk and half excavated from the living rock of the hill, had a front a full 100 feet in height, and beyond, the chimneys and wheels, the cranes and covers of their worksheds rose marvelously against the sky. Through a circular window in the house there was visible a spout from which some white-hot metal dripped and dripped in measured drops into a receptacle out of sight. The place was enclosed and rudely fortified by monstrous banks of earth backed with steel, both over the crests of the downs above and across the dip of the valley. It needed something of common size to mark the nature of the scale. The train that came rattling from Sevenoaks athwart their vision, and presently plunged into the tunnel out of their sight, looked by contrast with them like some small-sized automatic toy. "They have made all the woods this side of Igtham out of bounds," said one, "and moved the board that was out by Knockholt 2 miles and more this way." "It is the least they could do," said the youngest after a pause. "They are trying to take the wind out of Caterham's sails." "It's not enough for that, and it is almost too much for us," said the third. "They're cutting us off from Brother Redwood. Last time I went to him, the red notices had crept a mile in either way. The road to him along the downs is no more than a narrow lane." The speaker thought. "What has come to our Brother Redwood?" "Why?" said the eldest brother. The speaker hacked a bough from his pine. "He was as though he wasn't awake. He didn't seem to listen to what I had to say, and he said something of love." The youngest tapped his girder on the edge of his iron sole and laughed. "Brother Redwood," he said, "has dreams." Neither spoke for a space. Then the eldest brother said, "This cooping up and cooping up grows more than I can bear. At last, I believe they will draw a line round our boots and tell us to live on that." The middle brother swept aside a heap of pine boughs with one hand and shifted his attitude. "What they do now is nothing to what they will do when Caterham has power." "If he gets power," said the youngest brother, smiting the ground with his girder. "As he will," said the eldest, staring at his feet. The middle brother ceased his lopping, and his eye went to the great banks that sheltered them about. "Then, brothers," he said, "our youth will be over, and, as Father Redwood said to us long ago, we must quit ourselves like men." "Yes," said the eldest brother, "but what exactly does that mean? Just what does it mean, when that day of trouble comes?" He, too, glanced at those rude, vast suggestions of entrenchment about them, looking not so much at them as through them and over the hills to the innumerable multitudes beyond. Something of the same sort came into all their minds, a vision of little people coming out to war, in a flood, the little people, inexhaustible, incessant, malignant. "They are little," said the youngest brother, "but they have numbers beyond counting, like the sands of the sea. They have arms, they have weapons even, that our brothers in Sunderland have made. Besides, brothers, except for vermin, except for little accidents with evil things, what have we seen of killing?" "I know," said the eldest brother. "For all that, we are what we are. When the day of trouble comes, we must do the thing we have to do." He closed his knife with a snap, the blade was the length of a man, and used his new pine staff to help himself rise. He stood up and turned towards the squat gray immensity of the house. The crimson of the sunset caught him as he rose, caught the mail and clasps about his neck, and the woven metal of his arms, and to the eyes of his brother it seemed as though he was suddenly suffused with blood. As the young giant rose, a little black figure became visible to him against that western incandescence on the top of the embankment that towered above the summit of the down. The black limbs waved in ungainly gestures. Something in the fling of the limbs suggested haste to the young giant's mind. He waved his pine mast in reply, filled the whole valley with his vast "Hello!" threw a "Something's up" to his brothers, and set off in 20-foot strides to meet and help his father. 5. It chanced, too, that a young man who was not a giant was delivering his soul about these sons of Chaucer just at that same time. He had come over the hills beyond Sevenoaks, he and his friend, and he, it was, did the talking. In the hedge as they came along they had heard a pitiful squealing, and had intervened to rescue 3 nestling tits from the attack of a couple of giant ants. That adventure it was had set him talking. "Reactionary," he was saying as they came within sight of the Kosser encampment. "Who wouldn't be reactionary? Look at that square of ground, that space of God's earth that was once sweet and fair, torn, desecrated, disemboweled. Those sheds, that great wind-wheel, that monstrous wheeled machine, those dikes. Look at those 3 monsters squatting there, plotting some ugly devilment or other. Look at all the land." His friend glanced at his face. "You have been listening to Caterham," he said. "Using my eyes, looking a little into the peace and order of the past we leave behind. This foul food is the last shape of the devil, still set as ever upon the ruin of our world. Think what the world must have been before our days, what it was still when our mothers bore us, and see it now. Think how these slopes once smiled under the golden harvest, how the hedges, full of sweet little flowers, parted the modest portion of this man from that, how the ruddy farmhouses dotted the land, and the voice of the church bells from yonder tower stilled the whole world each Sabbath into Sabbath prayer. And now, every year, still more and more of monstrous weeds, of monstrous vermin, and these giants growing all about us, straddling over us, blundering against all that is subtle and sacred in our world. Why, here, look!" He pointed, and his friend's eyes followed the line of his white finger. "One of their footmarks, see? It has smashed itself 3 feet deep and more, a pitfall for horse and rider, a trap for the unwary. There is a briar rose smashed to death. There is grass uprooted, and a teasel crushed aside. A farmer's drainpipe snapped, and the edge of the pathway broken down. Destruction! So they are doing all over the world, all over the order and decency the world of men has made. Trampling on all things. Reaction, what else?" "But reaction? What do you hope to do?" "Stop it!" cried the young man from Oxford, "before it is too late." "But—" "It's not impossible," cried the young man from Oxford with a jump in his voice. "We want the firm hand. We want the subtle plan, the resolute mind. We have been mealy-mouthed and weak-handed. We have trifled and temporized, and the food has grown and grown. Yet even now—" He stopped for a moment. "This is the echo of Caterham," said his friend. Even now there is hope, abundant hope, if only we make sure of what we want and what we mean to destroy. The mass of people are with us, much more with us than they were a few years ago. The law is with us, the constitution and order of society, the spirit of the established religions, the customs and habits of mankind are with us, and against the food. Why should we temporize? Why should we lie? We hate it. We don't want it. Why, then, should we have it? Do you mean to just grizzle and obstruct passively and do nothing, till the sands are out?" He stopped short and turned about. "Look at that grove of nettles there. In the midst of them are homes, deserted, where once clean families of simple men played out their honest lives. And there—" he swung round to where the young Cossers muttered to one another of their wrongs. "Look at them, and I know their father, a brute, a sort of brute beast with an intolerant loud voice, a creature who has run amok in our all too merciful world for the last 30 years and more. An engineer. To him all that we hold dear and sacred is nothing, nothing. The splendid traditions of our race and land, the noble institutions, the venerable order, the broad slow march from precedent to precedent that has made our English people great and the sunny island free, it is all an idle tale told and done with. Some claptrap about the future is worth all these sacred things. The sort of man who would run a tramway over his mother's grave if he thought that was the cheapest line the tramway could take. And you think to temporize, to make some scheme of compromise that will enable you to live in your way while that machinery lives in its. I tell you it is hopeless, hopeless. As well make treaties with a tiger. They want things monstrous. We want them sane and sweet. It is one thing or the other." "But what can you do?" "Much. All. Stop the food. They are still scattered, these giants, still immature and disunited. Chain them, gag them, muzzle them. At any cost, stop them. It is their world or ours. Stop the food. Shut up these men who make it. Do anything to stop Kosser. You don't seem to remember. 1 generation, only 1 generation needs holding down, and then we could level those mounds there, fill up their footsteps, take the ugly sirens from our church towers, smash all our elephant guns, and turn our faces again to the old order, the ripe old civilization for which the soul of man is fitted." "It's a mighty effort." "For a mighty end. And if we don't you see the prospect before us clear as day? Everywhere the giants will increase and multiply. Everywhere they will make and scatter the food. The grass will grow gigantic in our fields, the weeds in our hedges, the vermin in the thickets, the rats in the drains, more and more and more. This is only a beginning. The insect world will rise on us. The plant world, the very fishes in the sea, will swamp and drown our ships. Tremendous growths will obscure and hide our houses, smother our churches, smash and destroy all the order of our cities, and we shall become no more than a feeble vermin under the heels of the new race. Mankind will be swamped and drowned in things of its own begetting, and all for nothing. Size, mere size, enlargement and da capo. Already we go picking our way among the first beginnings of the coming time, and all we do is to say, 'How inconvenient,' to grumble and do nothing. No!" He raised his hand. "Let them do the thing they have to do, so also will I. I am for reaction, unstinted and fearless reaction. Unless you mean to take this food also, what else is there to do in all the world? We have trifled in the middle ways too long. You! Trifling in the middle ways is your habit, your circle of existence, your space and time. So, not I. I am against the food, with all my strength and purpose against the food." He turned on his companion's grunt of dissent. "Where are you?" "It's a complicated business." "Oh, driftwood," said the young man from Oxford very bitterly, with a fling of all his limbs. "The middle way is nothingness. It is one thing or the other. Eat or destroy. Eat or destroy. What else is there to do?" Book 3, Chapter 2, Parts 1 and 2 of The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth by H.G. Wells. Now it chanced in the days when Catharine was campaigning against the Boom children before the general election that was, amidst the most tragic and terrible circumstances, to bring him into power, that the giant princess, that serene highness whose early nutrition had played so great a part in the brilliant career of Dr. Winkles, had come from the kingdom of her father to England, on an occasion that was deemed important. She was affianced for reasons of state to a certain prince, and the wedding was to be made an event of international significance. There had arisen mysterious delays. Rumor and imagination collaborated in the story, and many things were said. There were suggestions of a recalcitrant prince who declared he would not be made to look like a fool, at least to this extent. People sympathized with him. That is the most significant aspect of the affair. Now, it may seem a strange thing, but it is a fact that the giant princess, when she came to England, knew of no other giants whatever. She had lived in a world where tact is almost a passion, and reservations the air of one's life. They had kept the thing from her. They had hedged her about from sight or suspicion of any gigantic form, until her appointed coming to England was due. Until she met young Redwood, she had no inkling that there was such a thing as another giant in the world. In the kingdom of the father of the princess, there were wild wastes of upland and mountains, where she had been accustomed to roam freely. She loved the sunrise and the sunset, and all the great drama of the open heavens more than anything else in the world. But among a people at once so democratic and so vehemently loyal as the English, her freedom was much restricted. People came in brakes, in excursion trains, in organized multitudes to see her. They would cycle long distances to stare at her, and it was necessary to rise betimes if she would walk in peace. It was still near the dawn that morning when young Redwood came upon her. The great park near the palace where she lodged stretched for a score of miles and more, west and south of the western palace gates. The chestnut trees of its avenues reached high above her head. Each one, as she passed it, seemed to proffer a more abundant wealth of blossom. For a time she was content with sight and scent, but at last she was won over by these offers, and set herself so busily to choose and pick that she did not perceive young Redwood until he was close upon her. She moved among the chestnut trees, with the destined lover drawing near to her, unanticipated, unsuspected. She thrust her hands in among the branches, breaking them and gathering them. She was alone in the world. Then she looked up, and in that moment she was mated. We must needs put our imaginations to his stature to see the beauty he saw. That unapproachable greatness that prevents our immediate sympathy with her did not exist for him. There she stood, a gracious girl, the first created being that had ever seemed a mate for him, light and slender, lightly clad, the fresh breeze of the dawn molding the subtly folding robe upon her against the soft, strong lines of her form, and with a great mass of blossoming chestnut branches in her hands. The collar of her robe opened to show the whiteness of her neck, and a soft-shadowed roundness that passed out of sight towards her shoulders. The breeze had stolen a strand or so of her hair, too, and strained its red-tipped brown across her cheek. Her eyes were open blue, and her lips rested always in the promise of a smile as she reached among the branches. She turned upon him with a start, saw him, and for a space they regarded one another. For her, the sight of him was so amazing, so incredible, as to be for some moments at least terrible. He came to her with the shock of a supernatural apparition. He broke all the established law of her world. He was a youth of 21 then, slenderly built, with his father's darkness and his father's gravity. He was clad in a sober soft brown leather, close-fitting easy garments, and in brown hose that shaped him bravely. His head went uncovered in all weathers. They stood regarding one another, she incredulously amazed, and he with his heart beating fast. It was a moment without a prelude, the cardinal meeting of their lives. For him there was less surprise. He had been seeking her, and yet his heart beat fast. He came towards her slowly, with his eyes upon her face. "You are the princess," he said. "My father has told me. You are the princess who is given the food of the gods." "I am the princess, yes," she said with eyes of wonder. "But what are you?" "I am the son of the man who made the food of the gods." "The food of the gods?" "Yes, the food of the gods." "But—" Her face expressed infinite perplexity. "What? I don't understand. The food of the gods?" "You have not heard?" "The food of the gods? No!" She found herself trembling violently. The color left her face. "I did not know," she said. "Do you mean—" He waited for her. "Do you mean there are other giants?" He repeated, "Did you not know?" And she answered with the growing amazement of realization, "No!" The whole world and all the meaning of the world was changing for her. A branch of chestnut slipped from her hand. "Do you mean to say," she repeated stupidly, "that there are other giants in the world, that some food—" He caught her amazement. "You know nothing?" he cried. "You have never heard of us, you whom the food has made akin to us?" There was terror still in the eyes that stared at him. Her hand rose towards her throat and fell again. She whispered, "No!" It seemed to her that she must weep or faint. Then in a moment she had rule over herself, and she was speaking and thinking clearly. "All this has been kept from me," she said, It is like a dream. I have dreamt such things, but waking... No, tell me, what are you? What is this food of the gods? Tell me slowly and clearly. Why have they kept it from me, that I am not alone? "Do tell me," she said, and young Redwood, tremulous and excited, set himself to tell her. It was poor and broken telling for a time, of the food of the gods, and the giant children who were scattered over the world. You must figure them both, flushed and startled in their bearing, getting at one another's meaning through endless, half-heard, half-spoken phrases, repeating, making perplexing breaks and new departures, a wonderful talk in which she awakened from the ignorance of all her life. And very slowly it became clear to her that she was no exception to the order of mankind, but one of a scattered brotherhood who had all eaten the food and grown forever out of the little limits of the folk beneath their feet. Young Redwood spoke of his father, of Chaucer, of the brothers scattered throughout the country, of the great dawn of wider meaning that had come at last into the history of the world. "We are in the beginning of a beginning," he said. "This world of theirs is only the prelude to the world the food will make. My father believes, and I also believe, that a time will come when littleness will have passed altogether out of the world of man, when giants shall go freely about this earth, their earth, doing continually greater and more splendid things. But that is to come. We are not even the first generation of that. We are the first experiments." "And of these things," she said, "I knew nothing." "There are times when it seems to me almost as if we had come too soon. Someone, I suppose, had to come first. But the world was all unprepared for our coming and for the coming of all the lesser great things that drew their greatness from the food. There have been blunders, there have been conflicts. The little people hate our kind. They are hard towards us because they are so little, and because our feet are heavy on the things that make their lives. But at any rate, they hate us now. They will have none of us. Only if we could shrink back to the common size of them would they begin to forgive. They are happy in houses that are prison cells to us. Their cities are too small for us. We go in misery along their narrow ways. We cannot worship in their churches. We see over their walls and over their protections. We look inadvertently into their upper windows. We look over their customs. Their laws are no more than a net about our feet. Every time we stumble, we hear them shouting. Every time we blunder against their limits or stretch out to any spacious act. Our easy paces are wild flights to them, and all they deem great and wonderful, no more than dolls' pyramids to us. Their pettiness of method and appliance and imagination hampers and defeats our powers. There are no machines to the powers of our hands, no helps to fit our needs. They hold our greatness in servitude by 1,000 invisible bands. We are stronger, man for man, 100 times, but we are disarmed. Our very greatness makes us debtors. They claim the land we stand upon. They tax our ampler need of food and shelter. And for all these things we must toil with the tools these dwarfs can make us, and to satisfy their dwarfish fancies. They pen us in every way. Even to live, one must cross their boundaries. Even to meet you here today, I have passed a limit. All that is reasonable and desirable in life they make out of bounds for us. We may not go into the towns, we may not cross the bridges, we may not step on their plowed fields or into the harbors of the game they kill. I am cut off now from all our brethren except the 3 sons of Chaucer, and even that way the passage narrows day by day. One could think they sought occasion against us to do some more evil thing. "But we are strong," she said. "We should be strong, yes. We feel, all of us, you too, I know, must feel, that we have power to do great things, power insurgent in us. But before we can do anything—" He flung out a hand that seemed to sweep away a world. "Though I thought I was alone in the world," she said after a pause, "I have thought of these things. They have taught me always that strength was almost a sin, that it was better to be little than great,
that all true religion was to shelter the weak and little, encourage the weak and little, help them to multiply and multiply, until at last they crawled over one another, to sacrifice all our strength in their cause. But always I have doubted the thing they taught." "This life," he said, "these bodies of ours, are not for dying." "No." "Nor to live in futility. But if we would not do that, it is already plain to all our brethren a conflict must come."
"I know not what bitterness of conflict must presently come, before the little folk will suffer us to live as we need to live. All the brethren have thought of that. Chaucer, of whom I told you, he too has thought of that."
"They are very little and weak."
"In their way. But you know all the means of death are in their hands, and made for their hands. For hundreds of thousands of years these little people, whose world we invade, have been learning how to kill one another. They are very able at that. They are able in many ways. And besides, they can deceive and change suddenly. I do not know. There comes a conflict. You perhaps are different from us. For us, assuredly, the conflict comes. The thing they call war, we know it. In a way, we prepare for it. But you know, those little people, we do not know how to kill. At least we do not want to kill."
"Look!" she interrupted, and he heard a yelping horn.
He turned at the direction of her eyes, and found a bright yellow motor car, with dark-goggled driver and fur-clad passengers, hooping, throbbing, and buzzing resentfully at his heel. He moved his foot, and the mechanism, with 3 angry snorts, resumed its fussy way towards the town. "Filling up the roadway," floated up to him. Then someone said, "Look, did you see? There is the monster princess over beyond the trees." And all their goggled faces came round to stare. "I say," said another, "that won't do." "All this," she said, "is more amazing than I can tell." "That they should not have told you," he said, and left his sentence incomplete. "Until you came upon me, I had lived in a world where I was great, alone. I had made myself a life, for that. I had thought I was the victim of some strange freak of nature. And now my world has crumbled down in half an hour, and I see another world, other conditions, wider possibilities, fellowship." "Fellowship," he answered. "I want you to tell me more yet, and much more," she said. "You know this passes through my mind like a tale that is told. You even, in a day perhaps, or after several days, I shall believe in you. Now I am dreaming. Listen." The first stroke of a clock above the palace offices far away had penetrated to them. Each counted mechanically, 7. "This," she said, "should be the hour of my return. They will be taking the bowl of my coffee into the hall where I sleep. The little officials and servants, you cannot dream how grave they are, will be stirring about their little duties." "They will wonder. But I want to talk to you." She thought. "But I want to think, too. I want now to think alone, and think out this change in things, think away the old solitude, and think you and those others into my world. I shall go. I shall go back today to my place in the castle, and tomorrow, as the dawn comes, I shall come again, here." "I shall be here waiting for you." "All day I shall dream and dream of this new world you have given me. Even now I can scarcely believe." She took a step back and surveyed him from the feet to the face. Their eyes met and locked for a moment. "Yes," she said, with a little laugh that was half a sob, "you are real. But it is very wonderful. Do you think, indeed, suppose tomorrow I come and find you a pygmy like the others? Yes, I must think. And so for today, as the little people do." She held out her hand, and for the first time they touched one another. Their hands clasped firmly, and their eyes met again. "Goodbye," she said, "for today. Goodbye. Goodbye, Brother Giant."
He hesitated with some unspoken thing, and at last he answered her simply, "Goodbye." For a space they held each other's hands, studying each the other's face, and many times after they had parted, she looked back half doubtfully at him, standing still in the place where they had met. She walked into her apartments across the great yard of the palace, like one who walks in a dream, with a vast branch of chestnut trailing from her hand. Book 3, Chapter 2, Parts 3 through 5 of The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth by H.G. Wells. These two met altogether 14 times before the beginning of the end. They met in the great park, or on the heights and among the gorges of the rusty-roaded heatherly moorland set with dusky pine-woods that stretched to the southwest. Twice they met in the great avenue of chestnuts, and 5 times near the broad ornamental water the king, her great-grandfather, had made. There was a place where a great trim lawn, set with tall conifers, sloped graciously to the water's edge, and there she would sit, and he would lie at her knees and look up in her face and talk, telling of all the things that had been, and of the work his father had set before him, and of the great and spacious dream of what the giant people should one day be. Commonly they met in the early dawn, but once they met there in the afternoon, and found presently a multitude of peering eavesdroppers about them, cyclists, pedestrians, peeping from the bushes, rustling, as sparrows will rustle about one in the London parks, amidst the dead leaves in the woods behind, gliding down the lake in boats towards a point of view, trying to get nearer to them and hear. It was the first hint that offered of the enormous interest the countryside was taking in their meetings. And once, it was the 7th time, and it precipitated the scandal, they met out upon the breezy moorland under a clear moonlight and talked in whispers there, for the night was warm and still. Very soon they had passed from the realization that in them and through them a new world of giantry shaped itself in the earth, from the contemplation of the great struggle between big and little, in which they were clearly destined to participate, to interests at once more personal and more spacious. Each time they met and talked and looked on one another, it crept a little more out of their subconscious being towards recognition that something more dear and wonderful than friendship was between them, and walked between them, and drew their hands together. And in a little while they came to the word itself, and found themselves lovers, the Adam and Eve of a new race in the world. They set foot side by side into the wonderful Valley of Love, with its deep and quiet places. The world changed about them with their changing mood, until presently it had become, as it were, a tabernacular beauty about their meetings, and the stars were no more than flowers of light beneath the feet of their love, and the dawn and sunset the colored hangings by the way. They ceased to be beings of flesh and blood to one another and themselves. They passed into a bodily texture of tenderness and desire. They gave at first whispers, and then silence, and drew close and looked into one another's moonlit and shadowy faces under the infinite arch of the sky, and the still black pine trees stood about them like sentinels. The beating steps of time were hushed into silence, and it seemed to them the universe hung still. Only their hearts were audible, beating. They seemed to be living together in a world where there is no death, and indeed, so it was with them then. It seemed to them that they sounded, and indeed they sounded, such hidden splendors in the very heart of things as none have ever reached before. Even for mean and little souls, love is the revelation of splendors. And these were giant lovers who had eaten the food of the gods. You may imagine the spreading consternation in this ordered world when it became known that the princess who was affianced to the princess, her serene highness, with royal blood in her veins, frequently met, the hypertrophied offspring of a common professor of chemistry, a creature of no rank, no position, no wealth, and talked to him as though there were no kings and princes, no order, no reverence, nothing but giants and pygmies in the world, talked to him, and, it was only too certain, held him as her lover. "If those newspaper fellows get hold of it,"
gasped Sir Arthur Poodle Bootlick. "I am told," whispered the old Bishop of Frumps. "New story upstairs," said the first footman as he nibbled among the dessert things. "So far as I can make out, this here giant princess—" "They say," said the lady who kept the stationer's shop by the main entrance to the palace, where the little Americans get their tickets for the state apartments. And then, "We are authorized to deny," said Picaroon in gossip. And so the whole trouble came out. 4. "They say that we must part," the princess said to her lover. "But why?" he cried. "What new folly have these people got into their heads?" "Do you know," she asked, "that to love me is high treason?" "My dear," he cried, "but does it matter? What is their right? Right without a shadow of reason. And their treason and their loyalty to us?" "You shall hear," she said, and told him of the things that had been told to her. It was the queerest little man who came to me, with a soft, beautifully modulated voice, a softly moving little gentleman who sidled into the room like a cat, and put his pretty white hand up so, whenever he had anything significant to say. He is bald, but not, of course, nakedly bald, and his nose and face are chubby, rosy little things, and his beard is trimmed to a point in quite the loveliest way. He pretended to have emotions several times, and made his eyes shine. You know he is quite a friend of the royal family here, and he called me his dear young lady, and was perfectly sympathetic even from the beginning. "My dear young lady," he said, "you know, you mustn't," several times, and then, "you owe a duty." "Where do they make such men?" "He likes it," she said. "But I don't see—" "He told me serious things." "You don't think," he said, turning on her abruptly, "that there's anything in the sort of thing he said?" "There's something in it, quite certainly," said she. "You mean?" "I mean that without knowing it, we have been trampling on the most sacred conceptions of the little folks. We who are royal are a class apart. We are worshipped prisoners, processional toys. We pay for worship by losing our elementary freedom. And I was to have married that prince. You know nothing of him, though. Well, a pygmy prince. He doesn't matter. It seems it would have strengthened the bonds between my country and another. And this country also was to profit. Imagine it, strengthening the bonds. And now they want me to go on with it, as though there was nothing between us two. Nothing. Yes. But that isn't all. He said— Your specialist in tact? Yes. He said it would be better for you, better for all the giants, if we two abstained from conversation. That was how he put it. But what can they do if we don't? He said you might have your freedom. He said, with a stress, "My dear young lady, it would be better, it would be more dignified if you parted willingly." That was all he said, with a stress on willingly. But what business is it of these little wretches, where we love, how we love? What have they and their world to do with us? They do not think that. Of course, he said, you disregard all this. It seems utterly foolish to me. That their laws should fetter us, that we, at the first spring of life, should be tripped by their old engagements, their aimless institutions, we disregard it. I am yours, so far, yes. So far? Isn't that all? But if they want to part us... What can they do? I don't know. What can they do? Who cares what they can do, or what they will do? I am yours and you are mine. What is there more than that? I am yours and you are mine forever. Do you think I will stop for their little rules, for their little prohibitions, their scarlet boards, indeed, and keep from you? Yes, but still, what can they do? You mean, he said, What are we to do?
Yes.
We can go on.
But if they seek to prevent us?
He clenched his hands. He looked round as if the little people were already coming to prevent them. Then turned away from her and looked about the world. Yes, he said, your question was the right one. What can they do?
Here in this little land, she said, and stopped.
He seemed to survey it all. They are everywhere.
But we might...
Whither?
We could go. We could swim the seas together. Beyond the seas.
I have never been beyond the seas.
There are great and desolate mountains, amidst which we should seem no more than little people. There are remote and deserted valleys. There are hidden lakes and snow-girdled uplands untrodden by the feet of men. There!
But to get there, we must fight our way day after day through millions and millions of mankind.
It is our only hope. In this crowded land there is no fastness, no shelter. What place is there for us among these multitudes? They who are little can hide from one another, but where are we to hide? There is no place where we could eat, no place where we could sleep. If we fled, night and day they would pursue our footsteps.
A thought came to him. There is one place, he said, even in this island.
Where?
The place our brothers have made over beyond there. They have made great banks about their house, north and south and east and west. They have made deep pits and hidden places, and even now, one came over to me quite recently. He said, I did not altogether heed what he said then, but he spoke of arms. It may be, there we should find shelter. For many days, he said after a pause, I have not seen our brothers. Dear, I have been dreaming. I have been forgetting. The days have passed, and I have done nothing but look to see you again. I must go to them, and talk to them, and tell them of you and of all the things that hang over us. If they will help us, they can help us. Then, indeed, we might hope. I do not know how strong their place is, but certainly Chaucer will have made it strong. Before all this, before you came to me, I remember now, there was trouble brewing. There was an election, when all the little people settle things by counting heads. It must be over now. There were threats against all our race, that is, but you. I must see our brothers. I must tell them all that has happened between us, and all that threatens now. 5. He did not come to their next meeting until she had waited some time. They were to meet that day about midday in a great space of park that fitted into a bend of the river, and as she waited, looking ever southward under her hand, it came to her that the world was very still, that indeed it was broodingly still. And then she perceived that, spite of the lateness of the hour, her customary retinue of voluntary spies had failed her. Left and right, when she came to look, there was no one in sight, and there was never a boat upon the silver curve of the Thames. She tried to find a reason for the strange stillness in the world. Then, a grateful sight for her, she saw young Redwood far away over a gap in the tree masses that bounded her view. Immediately the trees hid him, and presently he was thrusting through them and in sight again. She could see there was something different, and then she saw that he was hurrying unusually, and then that he limped. He gestured to her, and she walked towards him. His face became clearer, and she saw with infinite concern that he winced at every stride. She ran towards him, her mind full of questions and vague fear. He drew near to her and spoke without a greeting. "Are we to part?" he panted. "No," she answered. "Why? What is the matter?" "But if we do not part, it is now." "What is the matter?" "I do not want to part," he said, "only—" He broke off abruptly to ask, "You will not part from me?" She met his eyes with a steadfast look. "What has happened?" she pressed. "Not for a time?" "What time?" "Years, perhaps. Part? No."
You have thought, he insisted. I will not part. She took his hand. If this meant death now, I would not let you go. If it meant death, he said, and she felt his grip upon her fingers. He looked about him as if he feared to see the little people coming as he spoke, and then, it may mean death. Now tell me, she said. They tried to stop my coming. How? And as I came out of my workshop, where I make the food of the gods for the Cossars to store in their camp, I found a little officer of police, a man in blue with white clean gloves, who beckoned me to stop. This way is closed, said he. I thought little of that. I went round my workshop to where another road runs west, and there was another officer. This road is closed, he said, and added, all the roads are closed. And then? I argued with him a little. They are public roads, I said. That's it, said he. You spoil them for the public. Very well, said I. I'll take the fields. And then up leapt others from behind a hedge and said, these fields are private. Curse your public and private, I said. I'm going to my princess. And I stooped down and picked him up very gently, kicking and shouting, and put him out of my way. In a minute all the fields about me seemed alive with running men. I saw one on horseback galloping beside me and reading something as he rode, shouting it. He finished, and turned and galloped away from me, head down. I couldn't make it out. And then behind me I heard the crack of guns. Guns? Guns, just as they shoot at the rats. The bullets came through the air with a sound like things tearing. One stung me in the leg. And you? Came on to you here and left them shouting and running and shooting behind me. And now... Now? It is only the beginning. They mean that we shall part. Even now they are coming after me. We will not. No. But if we will not part, then you must come with me to our brothers. Which way? She said. To the east. Yonder is the way my pursuers will be coming. This then is the way we must go, along this avenue of trees. Let me go first, so that if they are waiting... He made a stride, but she had seized his arm. No, cried she. I come close to you, holding you. Perhaps I am royal, perhaps I am sacred. If I hold you, would God we could fly with my arms about you. It may be they will not shoot at you. She clasped his shoulder and seized his hand as she spoke. She pressed herself nearer to him. It may be they will not shoot you, she repeated. And with a sudden passion of tenderness, he took her into his arms and kissed her cheek. For a space he held her. Even if it is death, she whispered. She put her hands about his neck and lifted her face to his. Dearest, kiss me once more. He drew her to him. Silently they kissed one another on the lips, and for another moment clung to one another. Then, hand in hand, and she striving always to keep her body near to his, they set forward, if haply they might reach the camp of refuge the sons of Cossar had made, before the pursuit of the little people overtook them. And as they crossed the great spaces of the park behind the castle, there came horsemen galloping out from among the trees, and vainly seeking to keep pace with their giant strides. And presently ahead of them were houses, and men with guns running out of the houses. At the sight of that, though he sought to go on, and was even disposed to fight and push through, she made him turn aside towards the south. As they fled, a bullet whipped by them overhead.